faces from last time. So how many of you were at the last workshop? I think a lot of you. So I do want to let all of you know that I went over the surveys from the last program, and I really appreciate your sincerity and your time to write those comments on there. And it really inspires me to see how many people are really interested on learning how to grow food for their family. It really touched me to read those comments and everything, because it's something that generations back it was part of survival, and now we have conversations on there's been some strange things we've gone through with availability, and we want to learn things so that we can be able to provide things for our families, and that means a lot to me. So we will be talking about soils, site, and fertility today. And so with that, the main thing for this, and some people are like, soil chemistry, it's kind of a dry topic, and people may not be as excited about it. But if you get your soils right when you're prepping your garden, you can alleviate and prevent a lot of other issues. And if you do your soils right, building from the ground up, your success is going to be so much better. And so there are other, cultural practices and weeding and things that we have to deal with. But when you get your soils right, it really is going to make a big difference on how your garden grows. I'm going to skip through some of our slides there, but yes, the little yellow, not yellow today, it's orange. The sign-in sheet at the little square one, if you will fill that out, I appreciate it. This is just meeting our civil rights requirements, and we do serve anyone that comes in our door, and that's part of who we are, and we just are glad for people to be interested in learning. So these photos are from the Kickapoo Park Community Garden. This is in an area of Shawnee that has some challenges, and we were able to help with a grant project to help them get a garden started by a lot of the things we talked about last time. But this is just part of what we do with OSU Extension. So we're going to move into the conversation about soils. So how many of you know the difference between soils and dirt? So dirt is what's on your boots, and soil is what we grow in. So if you kind of think about a weed, a weed is a plant growing in the wrong place. So when we talk about soils, that is really what we're growing in. And I had a soils professor when I was in college that if you said the word dirt, he would get angry. He would threaten docking points, because he did really want us to understand the terminology of soil, and we'll get to that here in just a minute. So I do want to give credit to Dr. Zong. Hailin Zong is our soils lab professor on campus, and he has run the soils testing lab for about 27 years, I believe. He has a ton of experience, and some of these slides are from one of his presentations. And when we talk about soils, whether you're talking about big agriculture or maybe a wine vineyard, vegetable garden, we kind of take soils for granted. A lot of times we talk about the growing things, but soils are something that are just foundational, literally, in a garden situation. And many times they kind of get overlooked. These are some photos from Dr. Zong's garden. And he gardens very intensively in a fairly small space. He grows some really neat vegetables that we may not think about because he is of Asian descent. And so he grows things that are a little bit different. Some of the Asian cucumbers and some of the squash and things are just incredible. But he likes to grow gardens himself. He's not in big production agriculture, although that is part of his job there at the Soils Lab. And this is a photo of one of my gardens. You can see the tilled garden there, and no, my rows are not straight. My grandpa used to say you can plant more in a crooked row than you can a straight row. And so it's like I'll just claim grandpa's, saying on that one. But Green beans were going in this area. And if you look at my garden, yes, there's some crabgrass over here. There's some little weeds down through here. My main motivation of weeding is, to reduce the competition for the plants, so you don't have that weed competition. But I am scared of snakes. And so when I'm working in the garden, I have to, this was in a country location, and I had to see where I was stepping. It's a mental thing with me. And so people would laugh. It's like, I don't weed for the plants, I weed for my own benefit. So we all have different motivations. But yes, weeds are part of the garden, and that's part of the conversation. I've got cabbage back here, and I've got some crabgrass in there too. But to me, that weeding and that taking care of the garden is therapy. It helps me clear my head. I know it's good for the plants, but it is a way that I cope and process with things. So a garden is important for me. So these are some things that came out of my garden. Green beans are something that I could tell stories of snapping green beans with my great grandma and all of those kind of things. I'll skip that because it'll make me cry. So we'll just keep moving on that one. But what do plants need to grow? So we want to look at the things that they need: sunlight, soil, water, oxygen, and then climate and time. So when we plant our garden, we don't have instant results. It's not just a click and go kind of thing like much of our society is. But when we look at soil, water, and oxygen, all of these elements we're going to talk about today because they come from the soil. The water part of that, I'll explain what I mean by that here in just a minute. Climate, that's our weather. We don't have much control over that. But we can control what we're doing with our soils to a lot of extent. Time, that one just teaches us patience. We have to learn to wait on things. But a lot of times there are things going on in the soil and in that root zone that we're not seeing with our eyes. So that's something we'll talk about, what's going on in that space. So by definition, the nature and function of a soil. Soil is the unconsolidated cover of the earth made up of mineral and organic components, water and air, and capable of supporting growth. So that's kind of a complex definition, but we're going to dig a little deeper as we talk about this. So different from animals and people, our plants are stationary. So that soil is going to give an anchor. That's where those plants are anchored, it's where they're going to stay. They do not move around. So that soil is very important in stabilizing where they're going to grow. The spaces between soil particles, and I brought some soil with me today. We talked about some last time on seed starting, but this is a bark mix in this one, and you can see it has some bigger pieces. We can pass that around and it may help you understand this part of the conversation. So when you have a very fine soil, your water and oxygen spaces are much finer. So if you have a soil that has bigger pieces, think about if you have a green salad that has lettuce and tomatoes and bigger chunks, or if you have a coleslaw that's a lot finer texture and you have some more liquid and spaces in there. So in our soils, those pores or those spaces between the soil particles is where our water and oxygen flow. And we need both of those. So the oxygen is part of the process as the roots take up the water and break down sugars. It's important to have that oxygen available. So if you think about a soil that's maybe flooded or saturated, you have it full of water, but there's not any air. There's not any oxygen in that space. So that's where a lot of our soil problems or plant problems develop, because if the plants don't have enough oxygen at their root zone, then they will begin to rot. And when we get root rot, then the plants are going to fail. So it's important to understand that we need both water and air in our soil spaces. So temperature for soil also is kind of a buffer. if we think about the weather that we've had lately, and when we've had warm days and then we had that cold night and some moisture, the snow that we had about 2 weeks ago, the beautiful fluffy snow that we had, the roads were clear, right? Because the ground temperature was warm enough, it buffered that. And even though we may have had snow covering the grass, our roads were clear because they had enough heat. This last storm that we had, the temperatures were colder and we didn't have as much precipitation, but when that soil temperature drops, and if we hit that freezing mark, then we've got ice and a mess. So for our plants, that soil insulates. They're at that ground level, and so if we have several days of sunshine where that ground temperature is fairly warmer compared to the air, then that helps insulate the plants. If the soil temperature is really cold, then that's a deeper freeze for the plant material that's in that area. So the other thing that we're going to talk about is the nutrients in soil. And that's something that, if somebody brings a soil sample to the office, and I brought some with me today, and this is different from the soil that I passed around a while ago. This is field soil, or soil from the garden, just the in-ground garden, where the red bucket, that's potting soil. So we'll talk about those differences a little bit more too. And we think about our Oklahoma red dirt, this is classic, and it's really funny when people come here from other parts of the country. Why is your dirt red? They don't get it. And to us, it's like, that's just normal. So if we go up north and we see soil maybe in Iowa, and it's a dark chocolatey color, that just doesn't look right to us, but their soils are a lot higher in organic matter. So although we can't tell the fertility difference between these two with the naked eye, a darker color typically is going to indicate that it's got more organic matter in it. And so it may be higher in nutrients, but soils come in a range of colors. And so, when we talk about fertility, it's not like we can tell that exactly from just looking at it. So when we think about soil or land, and what does that mean to us? So for many of us, that may be home. If the garden that you're planting is at your home, you may have a property, and that may be where you call home. That can be a place to belong. When we think about our land, the heritage and our roots, literally, sometimes are in that property. And there's a very strong sense of connection with that. So when we think about the tribal part of that conversation, many of the tribes were transplanted to Oklahoma. And so, years back, I won't get into a whole lot of the heritage because I'm sure that Andy can do much better on that than I can. But when you're transplanted, then, you have to start over. And I had a page here. I left my notes. Well, I wanted to use my notes so I get it right. But anyway, I've misplaced my paper. Even back to biblical times, when we look at the book of Jeremiah, this part of the Bible was talking about when the Israelites were in captivity in Babylon. And one of the things that they were told by the prophet Jeremiah was to plant gardens, harvest your produce, marry and have a family, and continue on. And that inspiration is very important. If we get uprooted from our normal, it's important to have something that sustains us and keeps us sane, basically. And like I mentioned, my garden is my place to cope and how to deal with things. So even when things aren't ideal and, we may relocate, we may move, we may, sell a property and those kind of things. Many times we'll have those memories of that location, but even in a new place, we have to think about the opportunities there and to carry on. You know, it's important to continue doing what we know to do for our families. And so with that comes provision and resources. What does that property, where we are now, what does that provide that we can use? So when we look at the resources of a property, we look at the water access, what water is there. We're going to look at the fertility of that land. What is this going to be able to do for us, and how can we be good stewards of that? I went with Andy and Gabby and Craig to one of the farm properties here close to town, and we looked at the property with the idea of, you know, how can they best use that property and what are some ideas that they can do. And so it's important to take a look at what you have available, and there's some really neat opportunities there. And so it's important to kind of say, know what you're wanting to do, but then also look at what your property is able to support and sustain. And so that's something that we do site visits sometimes to go out and look at slope and maybe windbreaks and how that property is used. So we'll look at that a little bit more. So when we think about soil, it's a very dynamic system. I mentioned a while ago that we can't see what's going on under the ground. You know, we see that flat surface and we just think of it as a solid, you know, piece of ground, and we don't think about all the things that are happening there. But some of those processes are going to involve the addition of materials as plants die and break down, or even in the fall, as our trees drop their leaves, and we have the leaf material on the ground as our seasons change. We may have grasses that die back and those kind of things. We have removal. So if we think about plants that are growing, they are drawing moisture and nutrients out of that soil, and so there are things being taken away from that soil. And transformation. A lot of these things, you don't just go from leaves that fall from the tree to nutrients for the next plants. It's a process. So there's a lot of microbiology that lives in that soil. They call it microbiome, and there's all of these conversations about what's going on with the bacteria and the things in the soil that break things down. So that kind of transforms those fallen leaves into a usable material, composting basically, for what those plants can use later on. Translocation is a fancy term for how the water moves. So a lot of times, you know, we'll have rainfall, it will come into the soil, we'll have the plants that translocate that out, and the water vapor will exit through the leaves. So there's a lot of different processes going on there, and it's made up of these horizons or layers. So if you look at a cross-section of soil, you're going to have some bigger rocks, you're going to have different layers, and if you look at the side of the road, if you drive by sometime where there's either a bank or erosion, if you drive to down I-35 through the Arbuckle Mountains, you'll see the rock faces, you know, where the highway is cut through the rock. So in some places, you'll have a heavier layer of topsoil than in others. Sometimes you'll hit sand rock around this area, or sometimes you'll hit a very a thick layer of clay sometimes. And so that's something, if you have a hard pan of clay, the roots may not be able to penetrate as well. And so the deeper that you go, you get into harder rock soils and those kind of things. So for our gardening, we're usually talking about this upper layer of the soil, but it's good to understand this whole dynamic. And sometimes people may plant like a large tree and it just doesn't thrive. Well, it may be hitting a hard pan of clay and not able to penetrate the roots through. So in a lot of conversations, those may be different. But for our vegetable garden, we look for soils that have a good layer. I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that. This one's backwards for most. So anyway, when we look at that, so that upper layer, we want to look at how much organic matter we have. And in Oklahoma, that's usually a very small percentage. Many of our Oklahoma soils only have 0.5% of organic matter. If you get up to 2, you're doing really well. And that's the difference in the northern states, where I mentioned Iowa earlier and the really dark soils. They tend to have a higher organic matter level because their seasons are different. We have such a long period of heat in Oklahoma, a long growing season, that all that organic matter breaks down much faster. But when we look at soils, we're going to have a percentage of sand, silt, or clay. That's the mineral part of the soils. We have about 1/4 that is water, and 1/4 should be air. So that's where I was talking about earlier, that you need a balance between these two. If we have flooding situation and the water area is filled with water and the air area is filled with water, then the plants don't have enough oxygen to function correctly. So drainage is very important when we're looking at a vegetable garden. The soil particles, the sand particle is going to be your larger particle. Silt is a lot smaller, but then clay is just a very fine particle. So that's part of the problems with our clay soils for gardening, is that the particles are so tiny, and so they just are so close together that there's not much space between them. When there's not much space between them, then it throws off our water and our air ratio. So sometimes if we have a clay soil, we may want to consider doing a raised bed garden, which is something that many of you were able to do. And that's sometimes, if you have that clay soil, is a really good option to go another route. Or you want to mix enough compost and other material with that, kind of like that red bucket of material up here, where you're adding some bark and texture so that you don't just have that very fine clay particle that's just squeezed in side by side. So this is just a cross section of a seedling growing, and so you see this texture part here, and that's something when we talk about a soil, if it's a good loamy soil, it's going to be a balance of that sand, silt, and clay. So you're going to have some part of this is going to be like really stuck together and close. You can see the kind of little cavities here, and these are places where the roots can maneuver through there easily, and you also have good water and oxygen movement. This is the part that we don't see, we just don't see that part because we're just seeing that upper layer when we're looking at the garden. This is what we call the soil triangle. And so when we look at a soil from the texture standpoint, the percentage of sand, silt, or clay that you have is going to determine where you fall in this triangle. So I have lived previously in an area that was more of a sandy loam area. It drained really, really well. I didn't have to worry about overwatering. If we had heavy rainfall just day after day, I could still go out there and walk in the garden. In gardens that have a higher clay content, if you're looking at a clay soil or a clay loam soil, if you get heavy rainfall and you walk out in it, you're going to sink, up to your ankles or up to your knees sometimes. If it's a tight clay soil, you may not sink, but it may be just that slippery red clay. So the amount of water and air makes a big difference, and so you kind of have to learn where you fall in this triangle. And so the good thing about the clay is it holds moisture. It holds water longer than the sandy soil. So if you look at like last summer when we had the drought, where I am now, I have more of a clay loam, where before I had more of a sandy loam. So where I am now my soil holds a lot more water. It also has more fertility than the sandy soil. But in periods of time where I have a lot of rainfall, it takes a lot longer to dry out. So if you're thinking about the vegetable garden, you want to make sure that you have slope, or you have maybe a domed surface to your soil so that it can run off. or even the raised bed conversation is a good one to have. Sometimes berming up the soil, or if you have a flat surface and then you could just mound it up a little bit. We do that when we plant squash a lot of times. We'll make a hill when we plant squash, and so that is for drainage. So pH is a part of the conversation too. This gets into soil chemistry. And I won't spend a lot of time here, but the pH on the soil for gardening, we want between, sorry, I keep hitting the, there we go. So between 6 and 7 for most garden things is what we want to see. So a few things will grow lower and higher, but that 6 to 7 range is our target for vegetable gardening. And that is because when we look at the nutrients, the first 3 on this list, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, are our big 3 that we look at for garden production. So the taper on this, if you get to a low pH, if your pH is 4 to 4.5, 5, if you see up there on that very top nitrogen, this is a very pointed, the availability of the nitrogen is much smaller if the pH is low. If the pH is too high, it also decreases again. So each element is a little bit different in how they respond to pH. But this is why we target the 6 to 7 range, because it's the average of the best zone for nutrient availability. If your pH is too high, or if your pH is way too low, the plants can't use what's there. You may have the nutrients present, but the plants can't take it up correctly. So this is important to know so that we can test the pH of the soil, and then we can understand, well, like iron deficiency. When we look at a higher pH soil, a lot of our pin oaks really like a little bit more of an acidic soil, some of our pine trees. So a lot of times when they're turning yellow, we see this because the iron availability decreases as the pH goes up. So for vegetable gardens, you know, we want to kind of target this middle range, the 6 to 7 pH. So we'll move on from that part. So learning about your specific soil is key to your success. People may call me and say, hey, I'm growing tomatoes, how often do I water them? And it's like, that's really hard for me to answer because I'm not familiar with their soil. So I'll start asking questions. Do you have a sandy soil? Do you have a clay soil? What's the weather doing? You know, how much sunlight are we getting? Anytime our temperature and our sunlight go up, we're going to use more water. But if you think about cloudy days, and when we have cooler temperatures, we're going to use less water. But as we talked about all those different things with our soil textures and even slope and different things, your site is very specific. So you are going to learn your site better than anybody else, and that sometimes takes time. So when we talk about watering something, we have to look at how the plant is doing. Is that plant wilted? You know, is the soil dry? Those kind of things will help us learn when we need to water. So we will talk a little bit more about specific things. So the texture for air and water movement is we kind of want that middle texture. We don't want it pure sand, we don't want it pure clay. We want that sandy loam or clay loam type soil. This is going to provide a better soil for our gardens. We want enough clay present that it's going to hold some water when we have those hot days. If you go see the grandkids and you're not going to be home to water, you know, there are ways to mitigate that, but you want enough water there so that you're not having to be out there watering every day. We want a deep, permeable subsoil. So we talked about that upper layer of soil for vegetable gardens. Most of what we're looking at is that top, 8 to 10 inches when we're looking at a vegetable garden. But if you think about what we had last summer with our drought situation, that deep subsoil makes a big difference. If we have moisture in the subsoil, the roots will grow down and tap into that moisture in that lower layer also. So things like tomato plants are going to have a deeper root system than, say, like our green beans or lettuces and those things. So things like tomatoes and corn are going to need a little bit deeper soil, and so we want to kind of take a look at what that looks like as well. We want a good environment for roots to grow deep for moisture and nutrients. If you have plants and you have a nice upper 6 or 8 inches of soil, but then it gets really hard, and if you're just watering very shallowly, those plants are going to have really shallow roots. And we want to water less often but deeper so that that will encourage those roots to grow deeper. So when we do have drought, they don't stress as quickly. So you almost have to kind of train them. You know, you want the roots to grow deep, so if you're watering them just a little bit every day, the roots don't grow as deeply as they should. So if we're watering less often and deeper, then those roots are going to kind of stretch. They're going to reach for that water that's down deeper in the soil. So how do you know what your soil has to start with? We're going to talk some about soil testing, and this just provides a starting point because we can't really tell exactly by looking at it, and we don't really know what the pH of the soil is. So we want to monitor that nutrient level, and then an initial soil test will give you that baseline. So you know what you have to start with. And then you can think about, well, what do I need to add? How can I change this to make it better? So this is just a drawing of a typical home setting. So you have a vegetable garden up here. We've got a backyard lawn area. There's some landscaping on this side. We've got a front lawn area. So when we go out to do a soil test, if you have a garden space that's 10 by 20, or if you have 40 acres, the concept is the same. So you want to do a random collection of smaller samples, because when we take smaller samples from different locations, that creates an average. So if you were going to take care of all of this property the same, you would take one sample. You just want an average, you want a baseline over the whole area. If you're going to manage this vegetable garden a little bit differently, you could do a separate test for your vegetable garden, and then maybe test another test for your lawn space. Now, I do get some clients that want to get really specific. If you have a neighborhood and a high maintenance area, and you want your front lawn to be just outstanding, you would test your front lawn. Some people completely don't do a whole lot in their backyard, but other people live in their backyard. You know, they might have a pool back there. That may be their oasis when they go home, that they really enjoy this backyard being lush and pretty. So if that's the case, you could look at doing 3 samples: a front lawn sample, a backyard sample, and a garden sample. Now that would be for more maintenance and for more, different thought process and how you're going to manage. For a good baseline, I usually say just do 1. Kind of get a good idea of just what's in that general area. So how do we do that? So you can use this tool that's called a soil probe. It has a mark on it about 6 inches, where you have a 6-inch depth mark. So that's really important, because the way that the lab analyzes the soil is they take into account a lot of equations that they use to calculate what that should be. And so the 6-inch depth is important. So the other thing is you want to make sure that you use a clean bucket. And I'll have to tell a story on my son. I went to help him take a soil sample last summer. And I was like, okay, we need a bucket. And he grabbed a bucket. Well, he had been doing some mortar work, and I asked him, I was like, well, what's been in here? He's like, oh, well, I was just doing this. Well, mortar or concrete type products have lime in them, and it will change the pH of your sample. So it's very important to have a clean bucket. You don't want to have something that has had mortar or Quikrete, any of those type things, because it will change your pH. So when we got his report back, the first sample, he did a couple. The first one, the pH was a little higher, and I knew it was from the bucket because we didn't have a clean one to start with. So you want a clean bucket. You want to collect 15 or 20 cores from the area that you're collecting. And that's if it's that 10 by 20 garden or if it's 40 acres. Because that's the number that scientifically they use to create a good average. So it sounds like a lot, why do you have to dig that many places? But from me to Andy, if it's really sandy on this end of the garden and it's real clayey on that end, and you're going to have differences in soil type even in a small area. So creating a good average makes you have a better test result in your sample. If you're looking at 40 acres, it's the same concept, but you want a good average across that whole area. This soil probe is not necessary. It makes it a lot easier, but you can use a long skinny shovel, like a sharpshooter shovel, and just take a little slice. So you would push it down in the soil and then go over about 1 inch and from the other direction and just take a slice out of the soil. But you want to make sure that you're getting it about 6 inches deep. So you're going to have some grass or thatch in that top layer usually, so we just pull that part out. And then you mix that together in a clean bucket. And when you come to our office, you want to bring that in a sandwich-sized Ziploc bag. We will transfer that into a soil test bag for the lab and fill out the forms for you. But the soil tests that OSU provides are going to give you a routine test. 95% of the tests I run are just routine. It's $10 for the routine soil test, and that will give you your pH, something that we call a buffer index. And that is what, if you need to change your pH, that tells us by how much we need to change it. And that's part of that equation, and we work that part out for you. It will also tell you how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that you have in your soil. So those are the main plant nutrients that we look at and the things that your plants are going to need to grow. So subsoil nitrate is sometimes looked at for larger agriculture. Secondary nutrients like sulfur, magnesium, calcium, these can be important in some crops, or if you were doing a market garden and you were having trouble with blossom end rot in your tomatoes, looking at the calcium level. Sulfur can affect the pH, and sometimes we'll take a look at that. But most of the time, we just do this routine test. Other micronutrients that we may want to take a look at would be iron, zinc, and boron. Iron would be if we have a lot of chlorosis, say pine trees or oak trees that are turning yellowish. Zinc is very important for pecan production, and so there's certain instances we might look at these things. But if you look at this list, have you ever read the back of a cereal or the side of a cereal box? Or maybe you take vitamins, the list on their multivitamins. You're going to see things like iron, zinc, calcium, magnesium. A lot of these things, the nutrients in our soil are nutrients that are going to be in the plants that we eat. So we need these nutrients, and that's, if you think about it, we're looking at the nutrients that our plants need. Well, that's kind of the same, very similar to the list that we need. So that kind of shows you that nutrient cycle, because animals that need that nutrition from plants, that makes sense that those nutrients are then coming from the soil. So that kind of brings that full circle a little bit for us. Other things that can be tested is the soil organic matter, soil texture, and salinity. We usually only look at soil salinity if it's been like a previous oil field site, or if we're having issues with salts of some kind. I have seen a few cases of that. Texture, there's actually a test that they can do and tell you exactly what your soil texture is. But a lot of times we kind of do that field test, where we can pick up a handful of the soil, if it's damp, and we can kind of see how it holds together if it's damp. We can see how it crumbles. We can almost visually see how much sand. If it's a very sandy soil, if it's dry, it's just going to flow out of your hand. Where a clay soil is going to be slick if it's wet, and it's going to be hard as a rock if it's dry. So a lot of times we can kind of estimate how much clay is in a soil by feeling it. So sometimes you'll see people, reach down and pick up a handful of soil, and it's not the nutritional value that we're getting from that, experience of how that soil, what that soil is like, but the texture, which then relates back to how the air and water move in that soil. So then what? How does that help you? So the science part of this and the chemistry part can get into a really deep conversation, and I'm not a soil chemist, but I do know how that relates to the garden. So once you bring a soil test to the office, we get a report from the lab. And I didn't bring one with me today, but the soil report will then tell you, it'll have a sample number and your name, and then it will tell you how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium were in your sample. Then we will write recommendations. We'll look at your numbers, and we can put garden in for the test results, or if you're testing for lawn, we can specify what you are growing. And even within vegetables, if it's a market gardener, I've got soil tests on my desk right now for a local grower, and I have one for tomatoes and onions and potatoes. And so I will run that specifically for that crop. So some of those we have specific criteria because not all the vegetables even may need exactly the same fertilizer. The larger the scale, if they are growing and in commercial production, we look at that a lot closer, because that's their dollar value. That's their livelihood. But in a smaller garden, for most of our homeowners, we try to average that because you're going to be growing many different crops in that smaller space. So once we write those recommendations, then we'll either mail that to you, or if we email it to you, you'll get it just a little bit faster. So whichever you prefer on that. So when we think about what nutrients we have and what nutrients may be available, by having a soil test, then we also see exactly what we're needing to apply. And like if I have something and it needs 1 pound of nitrogen over the season, we may apply that once at the beginning of the season, or for some crops, we may apply half of it at planting time, and then we might apply another application 4 to 6 weeks later. So it depends on what it is. Sometimes we want to space that application out because things like nitrogen are going to move in the soil. If we applied a big application of nitrogen in April, and then we had all of those spring rainstorms and thunderstorms, and we had a lot of rainfall, the nitrogen will move with the water. So sometimes we can get leaching, or the nitrogen that we put down may get washed away. So if you think about it, if we use a slow release fertilizer or only apply half, if we do get those downpour rainfalls, our investment isn't going down the creek. It's also more environmentally responsible because we're not losing that nitrogen. But it's our dollars, it's our budget for the garden. We don't want to buy fertilizer and have it wash down the creek. We want our plants to be able to use it. So if we look at timing on applications and then only applying what is needed. For years and years, people would go buy a couple of bags of 10-20-10 and just put it down. Well, we've seen on a lot of our soil tests for lawn that our phosphorus number is high to excessive on some lawns. So we don't want that to end up in our groundwater or in our rivers and streams, but we also don't want to pay for something that we don't need. So that's important that we spend our dollars wisely. And if we have the soil test numbers, then we know what we need, and we're not wasting money on something that we don't. So if excess nutrients are not there, then they're not going to get in the environment, and that's an important part of the conversation. In some of our higher end neighborhoods where we have high lawn maintenance, then we have, a lot of times they may have a lake or a pond that stays green. If we can back off on the nitrogen in the lawn area, then the pond clears up. And it's kind of interesting the way that works. But I did some research on traditional Native American practices because I want to be able to provide you with information on how things were done in the past. So a lot of times when you look at historical native plantings, they didn't do a lot of fertilizer. Not like going to the feed store and buying 10, 20, 10. So a lot of the practices that were done were companion plantings. So when you talk about things like the Three Sisters, you have corn, squash, and beans. Well, beans are a legume, and so they fix nitrogen. Corn is a heavy feeder that needs the nitrogen. So by pairing them together, you are getting one plant is producing what the next plant needs. So some people don't realize that part of that conversation, but it comes down to what is in the soil and being a wise manager of that. The squash part of that, a lot of times would shade the roots of the corn and the beans, which would help prevent competition and weed growth. So you look at the three of those working together, and it is a good system. Another thing that they used a lot of times was terracing. If you look at different locations around the country, if you had a huge slope, they learned very quickly, if we can level this out and terrace, that their seed and their efforts didn't wash downhill. By creating a flat space, it was better for them to be able to work it, and it just made more sense on being able to have better production. Irrigation and collection of water use for summertime. If you think about, we didn't have as many wells, and if they were looking at using natural water sources like creeks and streams and rivers, if they were able to collect water off of a shelter and be able to maybe have a cistern type system where they were able to collect water and then carry that to the garden later in the year, that was often used for their irrigation system or being able to water when we get to the hot period of summertime. No-till gardening is kind of a buzzword that we've heard the last 10, 20 years. And so no-till gardening is where you're not turning over the soil, you're not cultivating as much. And part of the process on that is that when I talked about the soil microbiology, all those natural things that live in the soil, you're not disturbing them by tilling. And so no-till gardening is a method that is used sometimes, and it also, if you're not turning over that soil, you're not bringing new weed seeds to the surface, and sometimes it helps with water conservation. So there's many elements to that were used in the past. Phenology, I'll touch on the next slide. That was one I had to look up. So seed saving is also very much was a part of their culture, and being able to harvest the seeds, harvest the plants for food, but then also saving those seeds for the next season. So we will have a workshop on seed saving, I believe in June. We'll get a lot more into that. But when you talk about fertilization, use of fire and ash was used primarily. It's not like they didn't use any synthetic fertilizers. But fire is a tool that's not used as much today. In our society, people don't want to have the liability of a fire. But there are, in some locations it works better than others, but using fire to control weeds is very much part of the conversation. And if you look at Oklahoma and the prairie fires that they used to have, sometimes there were areas that they burned intentionally, and then sometimes you had the prairie fires started by lightning and weather events and those kind of things. that were not intentional. But if you look at the number of cedar trees in Oklahoma now versus what the Oklahoma looked like with more wide open prairies in years past, the fires would help control those red cedars. And so as we, become more organized and all of that, and we, put the fires out, the red cedars are encroaching on our properties. And so it's important to know, about these tools. And in the earlier days, they were used extensively for cleaning that area for production, for growing crops, and it did have a good benefit. The ash from fires, whether it be a cooking fire, in the fertilizer recommendations all say potash. That's a little bit different than fireplace ashes. It's important to note that straight ashes from the fireplace, when mixed with water, that makes lye. And lye can be used to make soap, but you have to know what you're doing. It can burn you. Lye can burn your skin if it's not handled properly. But ashes can be put in a compost pile. You can use ashes you have to know what you're doing, but it's very important. The pH may change a little bit, but ash is a good source of that phosphorus. So that is something that I wouldn't put fireplace ashes directly from the fireplace, into your garden. But if you can mix that with your compost, you can actually have a good success rate. That's something that you wouldn't do every year. So mixing ashes in it's one element that you do need, but you don't want to overdo it and then get too high of a level of phosphorus or to raise the pH. So if you're familiar with lye soap, many of the soaps on the pH scale are going to have a very high pH. So by mixing the ashes, you're going to be raising that pH level. So you have to make sure that you're balancing that with other plant material that will help lower that. You don't want to use it straight. But compost type applications using that can be helpful. A lot of times burying the waste, whether it be kitchen waste, fish and bones, a lot of those things we don't recommend using any kind of meat in the compost pile, but back in those days, if they were using fish for food, for themselves, the bones and the waste part of that, the things that were used to put under the garden, and a lot of times they would have a row and put in the fish bones. You let that compost, kind of like compost in place, and then they would have their garden there later. So if you think about bone meal and blood meal and fish emulsion and things that we use in the garden today, they kind of had this figured out, where those nutrients were coming from and what the plants were going to need. Microclimates were often used. So I mentioned earlier a windbreak, and on one of the properties that Andy and I went to, we were talking about potential of orchard, what an orchard would need for a successful site. And there was a natural windbreak of trees that protected the certain part of the farm from the north wind. So when we're talking about our gardens, microclimates and using windbreaks, using a site is something that, if you're standing out in the sun and you go over and you stand under the tree, it's going to be cooler. And so using shade and microclimates is something they figured out very early. I think they were smarter than us on a lot of things, on being able to say, okay, well, if I'm growing this and it needs these conditions, then use the natural landscape to help provide that. So growing healing plants is something that I won't get into very much, but many of our natural native plants were used at that time for medicinal uses. And that's not a field that I have a lot of experience with, but I have a lot of respect for that. In fact, when I was young, my grandmother gave me a book about healing plants, and that was one of the first books I remember on just being fascinated with plants and gardens. So phenology is one of those words I was like, what does this one mean? But once I read it, then I understood. So these are using the natural signs that are happening around you to know when to plant. Now, when I was here last time, and I have some with me today, we have this handy little Oklahoma garden planting guide. But if you think about generations back, they didn't have this. So how did they teach the next generation on what to plant when? So they use things like plant corn when the oak leaves are the size of a mouse's ear. Because if you think about in the spring, and if you think about our blackjack trees, they're one of the later ones to leaf out. And so a lot of times in April, my father-in-law used to say, don't plant your garden until the catkins on the oak trees are as long as a squirrel's ear. And that was his saying. So learning how to watch the things around you, the plants, and because that's going to change. It's not going to be April 15th every year. So the weather is going to change a little bit. So these are things that were used in the past. Plant peas when the forsythia blooms. When do forsythias bloom here? Pretty early. They're going to bloom in March. So peas are a cool season plant, and they like the cooler temperatures. They can take a light frost. So planting the cool season things when the forsythia blooms, that makes sense. Okay, this list is going to change depending on where you live, right? But they were able to observe what was around them, and so these were ways that they could decide what to plant. So plant cucumbers and squash when the lilac flowers fade. Okay, lilacs don't bloom until May or so. So our warm season vegetables that like the warmer weather, they would wait until the lilacs were done blooming. So, these are things that you would have to kind of be careful about using and be very conscious of what's around you and when they bloom. But, we have dates that we can look at now. But things like this were used so that they could pass down and people could remember, when should I plant this? If they planted too early, they could lose their crop to a freeze. If they planted too late, it might not have time to mature. So the timing on this is very important. So I thought that was very interesting. Some of these I've heard through the years, and some things we do have to be a little bit careful if it's folklore and it's not tested. But these were some things that they were able to use on knowing when to plant. So we'll move on into site selection a little bit more. I touched on that with microclimates because when we think about what plants need. So most of our vegetable gardens are going to need at least 6 or 8 hours of sunlight in order to produce well. We want a well-drained soil. So that's when if you walk out into a yard space and you have a place that usually stays wet, or you have a place where the gutter from the house comes down and it kind of ponds or puddles there, you don't want to plant your vegetable garden right there. So you might look for a place that has a little bit more of a sandy soil, or you might want to have a little bit of a slope. If you have some slope and that water's not going to puddle, it will just run on down the hill. That might be a good spot. If you have a very steep slope, on the other hand, it may be a hard task to keep that watered in the summertime, because when you do apply water, it's going to run down the hill. So you want a place, and that's why the terracing was used. You want to be able to have a level enough place that when you apply water, it can soak into that soil so that the plants can use it. So access to a clean water supply is also very important. If you have well water, that usually you would want the well water to be safe for you. But if you want to think about growing vegetables, you want to think about water that you can also is safe for you to use for consumption. I'll get into that a little bit more here in a little bit. Most of our rural water is it has requirements and is going to be safe to use as far as from the water district. If you have city water, that must be tested and be what we call potable water. A windbreak to the north is ideal, but it's optional. If you have a place where you have a location where you have a windbreak, if you're pushing your limits on planting too early, if you have a windbreak, it's going to save you about 10 degrees usually. So if you can plant on the south side of a building or a structure, south side of the barn, that building is going to provide a buffer. So if we do have a later freeze or a frost, and you've already got your plants in, a windbreak is going to help you a little bit. On the other end of that, if you have a windbreak to the south, and it's going to help break that hot, drying wind in the summertime. So sometimes we can look at using fences or a row of trees or a house or building for a windbreak for our gardens. Good airflow is also important though. If you have a place that is boxed in with fences and you just don't get any airflow, if we have those days of really high humidity, we get a lot of rainy days in the spring and the air just hangs and you don't have airflow in there, you can have issues with things like powdery mildew. It can just stay too wet and soggy and it just may not dry out fast enough. So actually some air movement in the garden is a really good thing. So when we look at a site, all of these things are important. If we can, shelter the plants a little from that north wind, if we're having weather changes, that can help. And then also that protection from the south wind as well. But you do want air moving in that space. So I'm going to touch on just a couple of things to think about because I'm on a produce safety team and I'm going to show you a couple of slides from that. It's something that I don't want you to stress over, but I want you to kind of like stop and think and the light bulb go on. So things, how many of you have heard about recalls? Recalls of lettuce, recalls of, tomatoes or peppers. Lettuce and spinach seems to be the bad guys, So I'm going to touch on that a little bit because if you think about things that we do and in planning a garden site, if we think ahead, we can prevent a lot of these things. And that's one thing that being on the produce safety team, we go to different commercial growers around the state. And so they can ask, I partner with the Department of Agriculture. And so it's an educational visit where we go and we talk to the growers and we look at their operation and we look for any red flags. We look for things that they might need to change so that they have safe produce going into the market. So it's all about education. So if we look at possible contamination sources for our produce, we have people, sometimes we're messy, so that could be part of the conversation. Animals, if you have wild animals in an area, we can't control where they fly or where they go and what they do, because when they eat, they're also going to leave deposits behind them, right? So we want to think about that. From the human side of this, you think, well, how do we contaminate that? Well, if we're sick, if a produce grower has workers that are sick and they're harvesting that day, if you think about when we go to our kitchen, it's like wash your hands before you come help, prepare the food. Well, we want to teach, make sure that even though we're thinking about on a farm, and we have dirt and we have, that's part of being on the farm is getting dirty. But we want to think about when we have food that's not being cooked. So if you think about leafy greens and things that are not going to be cooked before we eat them, if you had a worker that was working and he was sick while he was harvesting and he coughed on that produce, that then, it stays on that produce and that's how things can spread sometimes. So we also can have a lot of things that are naturally in our soil. A lot of the bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella, it naturally lives in our bodies day to day. It can live in the soil. It can live in animals. So these are things that are naturally there, but if they get out of balance or are in the wrong climate, they can grow too fast and then make us sick, right? So clean water is something I already touched on too. We want to make sure that what we're watering with is safe to use. So sometimes we do use irrigation from a pond or maybe in Arizona and California they use canals. open irrigation water. Well, some of the lettuce and spinach recalls had come from Arizona because they were watering with this irrigation water that the children had been playing in the summertime to cool off. Well, little ones are not always going to exit the pool when they need to do their business, and you can end up with contamination in that water. So they did trace back one of the lettuce recalls from Arizona to an area of irrigation water that was a frequent playground for the children. And you think, oh, they're not hurting anything. But if that water is then used to water root crops or lettuce and leafy greens, that's where the problem is, because we don't cook it before we eat it. So we want to think about using clean water for our irrigation. If it's things like tomatoes or corn that grow up off the ground, you have a lot less risk because those things are not in direct contact. And many times our sunlight and just the elements are going to break those bacteria down. But we want to do things safe in the first place. So sometimes if we had any contamination from these, our buildings and equipment and tools are also sometimes at risk. So in a commercial operation, then they have to go in and they have to clean those tools on a regular basis. If they're harvesting lettuce with a knife, they have to clean that knife on a certain interval so that if they do get contamination, that they're cleaning it so we don't have an issue. So if you look at a farm, and I don't want to like scare anybody or this is kind of like the worst case scenario. So when you think about where our gardens are located, in relation to, okay, up here we have a feeding operation, a livestock operation. So if we get a heavy rain, the manure from that is going to run off into your production area. Sometimes this area is going to be cleaned out and you might have a manure storage area. That's very common on a farm. Where you've cleaned out the feedlot and you have a pile of manure over here. You just want to make sure that if we do have rainfall, that's not draining into the garden. When we look at our waterways, you might have a stream or a river, and we want to make sure that, sometimes we may have livestock in that area, even wild animals, they may be frequenting that area. So it's important to know that if you are using streams to irrigate, that you want to make sure and kind of be aware of what's upstream, right? You don't want to be putting water on the produce that's going to be an issue. And then also, you've got wildlife down here. Are they going to roam through the field? Are they going to do their business? Birds flying overhead, we can't control that. But if you have a grow operation and, that's open air, we're not going to prevent these birds from flying over. But that's a training process so that when you have workers down here harvesting, if you see bird poop as you go, you don't harvest that one. It never leaves the field when you're harvesting. It doesn't go in your truck. It doesn't go in your harvest bins, because then when you go back to the packing house, you don't even want to just leave it in the field. Because when you bring things into the packing house, you want it to be clean. So these are things that we train people on so that you kind of stop and think about where are the possibilities for contamination. And one of our examples we use is like, Joe's over here and he's picking watermelon and he finds this big pretty watermelon that's just ripe and the curl on the end is dry and he knows it's the right time to harvest. But it's got a big splat of bird poop on it, and he's like, but we'll just wash it off. But commercially, really you need to set that aside because in handling that, and then it goes in the pickup and it goes on the trailer, and then it's going to spread that to the other, fruit that's around it. So we want things to be clean when they're going to the packing shed, and we want the water that's going to our gardens to be clean as well. So for the homeowner, why are we talking commercial, right? So a lot of homeowners might have chickens. Eggs are really expensive right now. But you want to think about, don't put your chicken coop on the highest point right above where your garden is. If we get heavy rainfall, you don't want any runoff from your livestock to be going to your garden area. So when we set up a site for a growing operation, or even for our home garden, we want to think about where are our pets, where is the water runoff going to come from, and if you happen to have a septic system that's aerobic, you don't want that near your vegetable garden. I get that call pretty frequently because in town people may have an aerobic system if they're not on city sewer systems. So you want to look at the whole area. You want to look at wind patterns and water movement. You want to think about previous uses for that property. If it were a larger property, we have to be a little bit careful. Landfills, a lot of times reclamation has to be done before that can be used for any kind of production. Manure applications can be very helpful for a garden, but we want to do that in the fall. We want 120 days between manure application and the harvest of that produce. So if you apply in the fall, that gives you plenty of time, but you don't want to apply fresh manure in February and then plant lettuce, because it's not enough time for things like E. coli and things like that to go away. So that's something that I just like to be sure and explain. And some people want to free range their chickens in the garden, and we do have to think about that too, because if you are growing things up off the ground, you know, you have to weigh that. But if you're growing anything that's in contact with the soil, those chickens are going to do their business as they're in your garden. And I would rather see you pull weeds and have garden scraps that you throw into your chicken pen than to have the chickens free ranging in your garden space. So we want to look at also maybe what your neighbor is doing for larger operations. If you have composting areas, animal production, if you're in an area where they might be spraying easements or spraying things for weed control, like right-of-way, if you're close to where they're maintaining a right-of-way, I had this experience personally where under electric lines, and even living in the country, but they had come through and done a spray. Our family had picked blackberries the week before the plants turned brown, and I didn't know that they had sprayed. So I had processed a whole bunch of blackberries and put them in my freezer. They were just wild berries, but we had picked under the electric lines because they had grown along the fence. Well, then the electric company had come in and sprayed the easement, and I had to throw a whole bunch of blackberries out because my kids were young at that time. And okay, maybe a little bit wouldn't hurt us, but you know, I didn't want to feed that to my family knowing that it had been sprayed. Because like literally the week after we had harvested, it's like, why is everything turning brown under, you know, up here by the road? And it was like, oh, they've sprayed, you know, and so we had to throw out our blackberry harvest that year. From then on, I just quit harvesting blackberries. I go to the back of the property. I just like, okay, we're just not going to harvest there. Which is sad because it was a really easy spot to pick. But you have to weigh those things and be aware of what's going around in your garden spaces or wild spaces if you're collecting wild. Wildlife risk, that's something that we don't think about. Their feces sometimes in the gardens. We usually are more concerned with them eating our plants, right? You know, so it's so frustrating to go out there and the deer have come in and mowed down your okra, you know, because they like okra too. But so these are things when we think about site that I just wanted to share with you because it's important to kind of think about that when we're setting up where our gardens are going to be. So you do want to avoid septic, lateral line drainage fields and aerobic systems, water runoff from livestock areas or manure, and then frequently flooded areas. This is something that anytime, I want to say in 2019, we had heavy rainfall, and over the Tulsa area, along the Arkansas River, there was a lot of flooding. And any produce that is in a flooded area cannot be used for food for people or livestock. is just too dangerous. There's too much in that floodwater. And so when we look at, sometimes in some neighborhoods, if you have a hill and you have terracing and you'll have a house here and then a retaining wall and then another house and another house. So you want to think about runoff. If you happen to live where your yard may get runoff from the street or runoff from a lot of other properties, you don't know what's in that water. So you want to make sure that you put your garden in a spot that's going to be safe. So this is my dry sense of humor here. Crop rotation, right? A lazy Susan spins around, right? So my grandma used to have one of these on her table, and when you're a little kid, it's fun to turn that little thing around. But if you have a dining table of the Lazy Susan, or a lot of times we'll have that in our spice rack, right? So we can spin it around and find our spices. So crop rotation comes into play when we have a vegetable garden. Not really, this is just a play on words here. But when we think about where we plant things in the garden, we don't want to plant our tomatoes in the same place year after year, because then we can end up with disease and pest problems. Not just tomatoes, but when we look at plant families, all of these things, well, this one's a little bit different. There's different ways to do crop rotation. This one is done basically because these are more fruit items. These are root crops. Then we have brassicas, your cabbage and broccoli and kale and all of those type plants. Leafy greens are down here. So this one is done more on like maybe the part of the plant that you eat. But then I have another one here that really breaks things down by plant family. And so carrots, celery, parsley, parsnip are in the same family. I'm meant to bring a handout of this. If you would like a copy of this, I can email me and I'll be glad to give you one. So this is one that explains that we have cucumbers, melons, and squash, watermelon. All of these are in the same family. So if we look at things like spotted cucumber beetle, they may start on our cucumbers, but if they run out of cucumbers, they're going to go right on down the line to these other crops. If we look at things like our corn and okra and these kind of things, these are not exactly in the same family, but a lot of our pests are going to attack a specific host. So if we keep this idea of rotation in mind, and you think, oh, that sounds kind of complicated. All you have to do if you have a small garden is take a picture of your garden. Just take a picture and then, you can make a folder on your phone or computer and just say, put, 2023. And that's all you have to do. And then kind of take a look at that the next year. And then you can say, okay, well, I planted tomatoes on the east side, so I want to move them over to this other side. And if you have a 3 to 4 year crop rotation, and some of our gardens are not that big. The garden that I have right now is smaller. And so I will have a little bit of a challenge getting this done, or I'll just have to make a bigger garden, right? But if you take a picture with your phone, some people will keep a garden journal or write things down. Some people really like to take notes. But if you look at that photo, and then next year you can think about, well, plant something different in that space. So if you're rotating through a different part of the garden, one, the plants are going to use different nutrients. So if you look at green beans or peas or pole beans that are a legume, they're going to fix nitrogen in the soil. So where you planted those this year, you're going to want to move them over a space and then plant either like maybe tomatoes or corn in that space, because both of those are heavy feeders and they will take advantage of that nitrogen that the other plant before it put back into the soil. So when you look at these lists, this one also is just kind of a simple legume, root crop, fruit crop, and leafy crop, where when you're rotating these plants are going to take different nutrients from the soil, In the case of legumes, they're adding nitrogen back into the soil. But a lot of the leafy greens, they don't require a ton of nutrition, so they're one that's not going to pull a lot of nutrients out of the soil. So by planting them in different locations, you're not wearing out one spot from the nutrients that are specific to that plant. And then you're also preventing disease and pest problems, because if you're moving the host around, it just takes the pests a little longer to find it. So that helps too. So it also can help with weed control, and that's something that by rotating the type of plant that's there, if you think about like onions, don't take up a lot of space, right? They just kind of grow straight and skinny. But if you plant squash there next, they have really large leaves and they will help shade out the weeds. And so some of our plants just don't take up as much space, and then others have really large leaves and are going to shade out. So I don't like to weed a whole lot, so I like to space my garden where the plants will help shade out and outcompete the weeds. I will keep the garden clean and weeded early, and then my goal is that they will grow big enough to help shade out the weeds underneath them as time goes on. I also am a big believer in mulching, and so that also will help. But by planting, and then if you weed early until those plants get big enough they can shade out the weeds, it reduces the amount of time that you have to spend in weeding. So many of our plant pathogens are going to be very specific to the crop. So by moving the plants around, then we avoid some of those. And like I said, every 2 or 3 years, 3 to 4 years is ideal, but this will help reduce the amount of pests that you have in your garden space. Here's another example where tomatoes are a heavy feeder. They pull a lot of nutrients to grow. They're a larger plant. Green beans are going to be a giver. They put nutrients back into the soil. And things like carrots are a light feeder. The leafy greens fit in this too. So where you would plant these, the next year you move them the tomatoes to this space. Your carrots go around to the tomato space because it's depleted the soil somewhat. So by moving these around, then you're going to be able to take advantage of the benefits of that. So, like I said, in a limited space, say you only had 2 raised beds. And so you're thinking, okay, well, how am I going to rotate? Well, sometimes if you add the element of a container garden, maybe using some cattle tubs or a large container to put some things in, that can add your 3rd year. If you only have 2 spaces, and then if you add containers, that gives you your 3, and that hits you in a better, in the more ideal situation. At one point, I had 2 gardens, and I really enjoyed having 2 garden spaces because I could plant all my cool season stuff in one. Sometimes some of those things that may not be finished when you're ready to plant your warm season things. And so I would rotate back and forth between 2 separate garden plots. And within that, then I would move things around. So sometimes we'll look at this because maybe we have a fence on one side of the garden, and that's where we always plant our pole beans. Well, that we have to kind of work with that, and can we use the fence on the other side or not? Sometimes if we're using a cattle panel for a trellis, well, is it worth the trouble to move the cattle panel? Or, we just have to think about strategically how we're going to do that. Sometimes moving those bigger items gets to be more work, and so sometimes it just depends on how your garden is set up. So I touched on space some last time on how we can plant things. I will go into this in more detail when we get to the raised bed garden class, which will be, I believe, in April. And so utilizing the space that we have, and like I said, I don't like to weed a whole lot, so I tend to plant things closer together. That way it overshades the weeds, but that doesn't always work. but you have to learn on how much space the plants need in order to grow, and make sure that you're not overcrowding them, because if you put them too close together, you lose that air movement that I was talking about, and then you get more pest problems and disease problems because you don't have good airflow. So those are things that we would call cultural practices that help us in our gardens. And since I'm on that part of this, I do have some handouts over here. I have one that's called Healthy Garden Soils. And this one has the logo kind of here in the corner that's called Earth Kind Gardening. And this fact sheet really helps kind of explain Earth Kind Gardening is a term that was coined by Texas A&M. Dr. Steve George is a man that I got to meet at a conference, and he was just fascinating to talk to. This is kind of a middle of the road. It's not typically your organic, strictly organic concept, but it's doing things in a more earth-friendly way. And I love this approach, and I also thought it would fit well with the tribal native culture, because of the way things were done in the past were done to take care of the resources that they had. So this explains the terminology for organic gardening, but using cultural practices and practices that help us take care of the resources that we have. This one uses what we call integrated pest management. So when we do have these problems arise, it's not saying we won't ever treat ever, but we will do cultural practices that minimize the need to treat. So by the way that we grow and the choices that we make in management, it can reduce what we're needing to do as far as any kind of chemical application. That's not to say we might have something arise where we might feel like the need to treat might outweigh the problem there, but it's a very natural approach to gardening, and I appreciate that a lot, and I garden myself a lot that way. Another one of the I'll get to that one in a minute. I have another fact sheet to share with you too. So this is some produce from my home garden in 2017. I have 3 children, and when they were teenagers, they just kind of ate us out of house and home. And they love salsa, and so anytime I had a good crop of tomatoes, I was just thrilled. I made a lot of salsa, and we had a lot of goulash and spaghetti and those things that help stretch the budget. But ideally, I want you to be able to have the produce that you're wanting for your family. You kind of have to gauge that by, is this a family of 2? Or is it a family of 5 with 3 teenagers to feed? The amount that you need to plant and when you harvest, we kind of touched on that last time. You may want to stagger your plantings for things like leafy greens and radishes and some of the root crops where they're not all ready at the same time. You don't want to eat the whole row of radishes at once, right? So there's a harvest window where we can, harvest every other one and kind of make that work and give them more room to grow. But you want to kind of think about, if you are wanting to can, that you'll want to time your harvest and maybe plant things that are going to produce heavier at the same time. So composting is the other fact sheet that I brought today, and I was visiting with one of you before. Composting is very beneficial. We talked a lot about the nutrients that plants need to grow, and we do have a backyard composting page that goes over a lot of the details. Composting can be as simple or as complicated as you want to make it. Many of our kitchen scraps, potato peels, onion skins, all those things can go into a compost pile. And by having a compost pile, we're cycling those nutrients back into the garden. If you're making salsa and you're peeling those tomatoes and coring the peppers, you're creating some waste. Rather than throw that in the trash can, you can put it in a compost pile. And after that has broken down, then you can put that back into the garden and it will provide nutrients again. So we look at the carbon to nitrogen ratio when we're talking about composting. So browns can be things like fallen leaves. It could be cardboard. It could be newspaper that's shredded. And then greens would be things like grass clippings that are still green, or maybe kitchen scraps. If your peas are finished producing and you're pulling your pea vines out of the garden, you've harvested the last that you're going to harvest, it's gotten hot, but you have these vines that are still green. That counts on this green ratio. So you want about half and half, because the greens provide the nitrogen and then the browns provide the carbon. And in that soil chemistry, as those things break down, it's a good balance when you have it kind of this ratio here. Carbon to nitrogen ratio, you want about half and half. It also requires moisture. So many times if we're throwing something out and we're making a pile, it's rounded on the top, right? You're making a pile of something. So if you will take and dish the top of your compost pile, when it rains, it'll collect water instead of the water just running off. So simply by making a hole in the middle of your compost pile, it will hold more water and you have to water it less. Usually we don't want them larger than 6 foot square for easy handling, and it heats up faster. So the goal is when you put these greens and browns together and you have some moisture, as that chemistry starts to happen, there's going to be heat that's generated. And that heat breaks down any pathogens, weed seeds, things like that are in this compost pile. We want to put plant material in here, but we don't want to add any meat or dairy. There's a couple of reasons for that. We can get bacteria in there with those items. And we also can attract things like possums and squirrels and things that are going to want to feed on those products. So you kind of have to sort that out in the kitchen. You don't want to put any meat scraps, fats, or dairy in here. And there's many options for construction for a compost pile. And this fact sheet has a lot of really good examples for that. So it can be as simple as a trash can with holes in the sides. It could be made out of pallets. If you think about, pallets have a board and a space and a board and a space. So that lets a lot of air into this area. Sometimes people might use chain link or chicken wire, just make a round one, So there's a lot of different designs. A lot of times I have done concrete blocks. If you happen to have concrete blocks that you can stack up. Typically these are going to be 3-sided because you'll need to access them from one side. The reason you need to access it is because you're going to want to turn that. You're going to want to dig and turn that. So a lot of times, if you start a compost pile and you layer a layer of leaves, a layer of kitchen scraps, and then I usually recommend take a shovel full of soil and just put some garden soil in there, because that's going to have those bacteria and those microbes that are going to break these other things down. So add a shovel full of soil or even some leaves or grass clippings on the top. That also helps keep the varmints out. If they can't just see the potato peels and things that are on the top, they're going to stay out of it a little bit better. And so once you get that layered, then that heat process is going to start. And so a lot of times as that, you let that set for a few weeks, and then you can turn that pile, you dig it out, and like if you had a 2-bin system, you have 2 bins side by side, you dig it out of the first one and you put it in the second one. Well, that's basically like mixing it up, right? It's going to stir those things together, and then it will heat back up again. So it will generate heat again as those soil chemistry things happen. So I'm kind of a lazy composter. I don't always get out there and get mine dug. And compost is going to compost eventually on its own anyway. If you do the turning system, you've probably seen the barrels that you can buy, and you can turn the crank and it rolls it. Some of them are a barrel that has a lid that goes on really tight, and you can kick or roll them. It's fun for the kids to do. You can just roll it back and forth and it mixes it up. Mine goes in the compost pile and it just kind of sits. And if you turn it and do that, it will help it heat up faster and it will break down faster. If you just let it sit, it will eventually break down. My compost might take a couple of years to actually break down and compost, And I'm not using mine in a way where I need it to be necessarily clean. As far as if you were very intentionally killing weed seeds, if you knew you had thrown some weeds in there that had seeds, you don't want to then be putting those back into the garden. So if you heat to a temperature of 140 degrees and you let that maintain for a few days, and then you turn the pile and let it heat up to 140 degrees, a lot of people actually have a soil thermometer that they will stick in their compost pile and they will monitor those temperatures. That is a really good technique, and there's a lot of science behind it, and it works really well. I tend to just let mine sit there until it breaks down. But if you've thrown potato peels and the pumpkin and different things in there, you kind of know when it's ready, when you can turn and dig it, and nothing is recognizable anymore. When it just looks like dirt, that's when you know it's cooked. When all of those things have broken down. Now, I did say no meat or dairy. A lot of times we will put coffee grounds in there, or we might put eggshells. Some people are very particular that they want to rinse those eggshells before they put them in there. But that is why we want to get to that 140 degrees, just to make sure that we're clean, like bad bacteria-wise. So once the products that you have put in your compost pile have broken down, and you've turned it, and then it looks like soil, and the question was brought earlier, it's like, well, what if it smells bad? I live in a smaller neighborhood and our houses are close together, is it going to smell? Well, a lot of times when things break down, there may be an odor. That's another reason why we want that layer of soil or the leafy material on top of there, because it will help filter out those odors. There will be some, but when you turn it, and if you put the right materials in there, it shouldn't smell really bad. And we even have like this troubleshooting thing. I'm like, okay, if these things are happening, what's wrong with my compost? And so there are a lot of websites that you can go to, but we do have some tips. This troubleshooting chart that's in here. A lot of times our pest problems are because we have meats or fatty foods in there. So, and one of the suggestions on here is to cover it with sawdust. I usually say leaves from the leaf pile, or if you've draped leaves, then a layer of leaves will do the same thing. But just that barrier a lot of times will help with that. If it's not heating up to temperature, that can be that you need more moisture, or that you need to turn the pile. So there is a lot of science to doing this properly. But if you leave it for a longer period of time, it will break down naturally on its own as well. So there's different trains of thought for that, but it can be very helpful, because then you're using products, instead of them going into the trash can, that you're able to cycle those nutrients back into your garden. So if you have questions on composting, that's one that we could spend like a whole class on its own. And if you're interested in doing that, just let me know. In Oklahoma County, in Oklahoma City area, I have the program called Master Gardeners, and we have some of you here today. So, but in our area, we have the Master Gardener program. In Oklahoma City and in Tulsa, they even have a Master Composter program, where people have really gotten into the composting process, and they really want to help people learn on how to do this. And so I could probably reach out to one of them if we wanted to do a composting, deeper conversation. This fact sheet's a really good place to start, though. I think they have a master irrigation conversation too. So we've talked some about watering today, but different ways to water a garden is something that we can also discuss, or call me if you have questions. So I did mention earlier that I appreciate your feedback on that survey. It really did mean a lot to me to see your comments and your motivation. Why do you want to learn to garden? And I'll kind of summarize that a little bit more and have a report to give back to Gabby on that. And that's something that, you know, it's important to know, well, why are we digging into this? You know, why are we wanting to know? And so the fact that you're wanting to have produce to feed your families, to share with your neighbors, I think is something that's very important. When we're eating fresh, we know what's gone into that product, we know how it's been handled, and we also have that fresh, nutrient-rich food that can feed us. And so that's very important. So I feel like we've covered a lot of material today. And so if you do have questions, I'll be glad to take any questions now or stay around for a few minutes. You're busy writing. Okay. So the reason we do the surveys is kind of to like pick your brain on, you know, like how can we do this better? And then also it gives you information on like, well, did I learn something? And how can we better do better programs for teaching? So I appreciate that a lot. Is anybody getting garden fever yet? Yeah. So we have these pretty days and we get sunshine and you go out on the south side of the building out of the north wind and it's just like, oh, I can't wait till it's time to plant. Well, planting times on things are going to vary a little bit with what you're wanting to plant. But cool season gardens, our planting target is February 15th to March the 10th. So we're about a week away from those early planting dates. So that would be your things that can tolerate a frost, that can take the cool weather, onions, potatoes, some of the root crops, turnips. Radishes are a little bit tender. Spinach, kale, cabbage, broccoli, all of those things, we're looking at a planting season really soon. My email address is up here and our office phone number. So if you have any questions, feel free to call or email anytime.